share my screen. Right. Can everyone see that that PowerPoint slide? I'm looking for nods. Yeah. Everyone okay? Yeah. Good. Okay, fantastic. So yes, I've got the topic of human identity. I suppose I should have said as well when I was introducing myself that I do a bit of work on medical ethics, have done for a number of years with the Christian Medical Fellowship, and I'm a member of the CMF, and we have a kind of working group that looks at different issues in medical ethics that come to prominence, and I chair that group, and we produce a series of papers. There's about 70, I think, online at the moment, covering a whole variety of different medical ethical issues. Today, I want to kind of give both an overview of a kind of Christian approach to medical ethics, particularly looking at how science challenges our beliefs as Christians and how we can articulate our beliefs in that context. And then we'll zoom in as well and look at some of the more sort of pastoral side of this. So why are my slides not moving? So this is roughly the outline. We're going to look at the big picture, sort of rival narratives really about what is a human being, what does the Bible say, and you know, what would people infer from science about human identity. Then we have a few questions on that, looking at kind of these big almost philosophical issues, and then we're going to zoom right in and look at a case study around end-of-life care and how this might play out pastorally. Which hopefully will be of relevance, particularly to those in pastoral ministry or hospital ministry, but also to all of us. And then a little bit at the end, what's the direction of travel on some of these ethical issues, and what should our response be as Christians? So I hope that's okay. I'm very happy to be interrupted, but there is a point in the middle and a point at the end where I'll stop for questions or discussion. So you may want to hold up, but if there's something that you want clarified, then please feel free to interrupt. So there's a Psalm 8 in the Bible where the psalmist looks up at the heavens and the work of God's fingers, the sun and stars that he's set in place. And the question he asks is, what is man? That's, if you like, the question we're going to be addressing here. What does the Bible say about human identity? And what does science say, and how do we put those things together? The creation narratives are, of course, I think where we would start when we're trying to understand what the Bible says about what humans are. Two accounts of creation are given in the beginning of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, the whole earth and universe is made, all the plants and animals, and then as the kind of pinnacle of that creative process, God says, let us make mankind in our image. And so crucial for our understanding of human identity is that we humans, and the people you meet in Tesco or get on a bus with or see on Zoom screens, these people in some way resemble God. What's very interesting is that it's not explained what that means. We're told that we are in the image of God. It doesn't tie it to one particular capacity, one particular faculty of human ability. It doesn't say we are like God because we're creative, or because we communicate, or because we're self-aware, or because we make moral choices. It simply says that humans are in the image of God. What does that mean? Clearly they're special and we're different from the animals, and in some way we resemble the Almighty. And then in Genesis chapter 2 we get a more intimate account of the Lord forming the man out of the dust of the ground, and then breathing the breath of life into his nostrils. And I think that's really important, that there is both a physicality about humanity. We're made of stuff, we're made of dirt and matter that is shaped into this form. But it's not we're not simply material beings, because God breathes life into the man and he becomes a living being. And that crucial combination of the spiritual component, which theologians talk about the soul or the spirit, together with the body, come together to make a human being. And that's reflected right the way through the Bible. Let's pick up now in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians. We know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, that's the body we live in, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan because we're currently living in away from God. We're living in these bodies which are so important to our identity, but which are broken, which are mortal. We're longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. We're longing to be there in heaven in our new creation bodies. When we're clothed, we will not be found naked. So there's no idea that the ideal form of humanity is a departed soul on the clouds. Actually, there's a temporary rendering of spirit and body that happens at death, and that is an incomplete state. And we are longing for the return of Christ and a new creation and another physical body, a perfect spiritual completed body. That is the great hope for Christians. And the picture there is a depiction of a scene from, I think it's Revelation chapter 5, of the souls of the martyrs before the throne, crying out for justice to God. And they're crying out because they're not clothed and they're handed white robes to wear. But when Christ returns, the dead are raised and the bodies and the souls come together. Someone's likened a Christian view of human identity to the £20 note. If I was to ask you what is the value of the material constituents of that £20 note, the answer is negligible. It's made of the same combination of atoms and molecules that you would find in any other bit of paper. There's nothing remotely special about the material there, and yet it is a thing of great value, or £20 worth of value anyway, because the Queen's face is on the front, and because there is a promise that if you present this to the Bank of England, they will give you your £20, I don't know, in gold, or I don't know quite what that promise means. I'm not an economist, but that thing has great value because of what is imprinted upon it. And that is very similar to a human view of the body, I think. There's nothing particularly remarkable about the carbon and the hydrogen, the oxygen and the iron that makes up my body. It's no different from any other elements, but it's the way it's formed together, and it bears the impression, bears the image of God. If you were to take that £20 note, which has a promise on it, if you burn the £20 note, get rid of the matter, you no longer have the promise. It's not worth anything. The promise disappears with the material. So it's a very interesting combination of form and matter, if you like, that gives it value. In the same way, our bodies are important, but they are important in the sense that we're imprinted with the image of God. So what does science then say about human identity? Well, science if you think of what's happened in the last 200 years and the way we understand ourselves and how our bodies work 200 or 300 years, we have come on in really extraordinary leaps and bounds. Sorry, that's quite a shocking screen, isn't it? I hope it's not making your eyes go funny. It's pretty stark. That is part of the human genome. So that is a gene called OCA2. Which we all know. I suppose it was in the mid-90s, I think, that the whole genome, human genome, was sequenced, and people talked about opening the book of life, having the instruction sets that if you have all of these genes, there's enough information there to build a human being. Really interesting. So this bit from the OCA2 gene, together with other genes, encodes eye colour. So something that we would view as really intrinsic to our identity. It's when children are growing up in school and they start drawing pictures of themselves. They're very interested to colour in the colours of their eyes, and they notice that they've got different colour eyes from their classmates, and we think of that as very important in our identity. Now, it's not to say that science promotes a purely genetic, deterministic view of human beings, but it does suggest that we are machines, that we are built by our DNA, and how that DNA interacts with our environment forms the people that we are. And science has given us an extraordinary look into what it is to build a human being, a human body. We've obviously been very much informed about this particular viral particle, which has turned many of our lives upside down over the last year. And what's extraordinary is how science has given us such a strong mechanistic explanation and technical fix to this new problem. I was reading a few days ago from an account by Daniel Defoe of the Great Plague in London in 1665. Now, he was only a boy when the plague happened, and he kind of writes what people think is a semi-fictional account of living through the time of plague, but it gives you a really interesting insight into how people then viewed the plague and how people now are viewing the coronavirus pandemic. Back then, Daniel Defoe is aware of ideas of contagion and that it is spreading person to person, but is very much aware of a divine explanation for that plague and sees it in terms of God's judgment and the need for repentance and so on, for personal piety. And there's a kind of discussion in that book about where the plague comes from and how to understand it. If you look now on any website, you'll be told that the coronavirus pandemic basically boils down to machines, little tiny viral machines, and then slightly bigger machines, which are human cells, and then those human cells working together to form a really big machine, our human bodies. And how these little machines get into the bigger machines and cause all kinds of disruption by infecting cells and activating immunity and so on. So science gives us a mechanistic explanation of what it is to be a human. It explains our bodies as highly complicated machines, and then it provides us with a load of really good technical fixes, whether that's drugs to stop viral replication, control the immune response, or vaccinations, which hopefully will prevent the problem before we become infected. And so science has done this extraordinary job of describing how our bodies work. And because of the success of that in describing disease, in preventing disease, we've come to rely on it. We've come to think that science is a method we should be listening more to. But what are the limitations of science? What doesn't science tell us? Well, we talked about the OCA2 gene, and we're back there now. If you get one base pair wrong in this gene, there's different ways mutations can arise and different patterns of mutation. But one of them is that one base pair swapped to G instead of a C, you end up with a condition called oculocutaneous albinism. The OCA gene stands for, is an acronym for oculocutaneous albinism, because that's the disease that arises if the gene is copied incorrectly. And you get these people with very striking appearance. This is white hair, pale blue eyes, white eyelashes, very pale skin, and associated disease. Actually, there's an association with blindness and with cancers of the eye and cancers of the skin. So we're starting to see how our bodies, conceived as machines, can go wrong. What science doesn't tell us is what to do with that. And actually, we can now detect that mutation. And very strikingly, if we're living in the UK, if we detect that mutation in utero before a baby is born, that baby can be aborted right up to term. UK abortion law allows abortion for underground sea for almost, it's effectively unlimited, up to 24 weeks. And then in the case of significant fetal disability, is allowed right up to term. So a child who has this mutation or any other kind of genetic mutations, which would lead to a significant degree of disability, can be aborted right up to term. So science tells us an enormous amount about how our bodies work. It can explain disease, sometimes it can treat disease, but we end up with this situation where we have human beings who are undeniably human fetuses who can then be aborted. So the interaction of science and our moral understanding is it proves very fascinating under a secular worldview. What's going on here at a worldview level? How can we acknowledge that an unborn baby is human, is clearly alive, clearly shares its genome with us, with perhaps one tiny base pair alteration, and that allows us to take the life of that baby where we would never dream of taking the life of a disabled person who's alive? What's going on here at a worldview level? How does the secular worldview work? Well, the answer is, if you read secular philosophers and try to understand how this mechanistic understanding ties with a very strong sense of morality in many of these people, it's through the idea of personhood. So if you accept a purely evolutionary viewpoint with no understanding of God guiding the process, you have this progression from single cellular beings up through primitive life forms, through chimpanzees, monkeys, chimpanzees, and then to modern Homo sapiens. At some point, personhood is conferred. And so, for instance, we would treat animals in a completely different way to how we treat human beings. We would kill animals for food. We would never do that for human beings. And really, without a spiritual explanation of what's happening, without the idea of humans in the image of God, How do people explain the moral rationale for that? Answer in secular terms, it's in terms of personhood. So personhood, to count as a human being, you have to have human genetics and this idea of personhood. And personhood is something you have to earn. And different people construe it in different ways, but to do with moral intuition, self-awareness, making decisions. At some point, someone becomes a person and then develops human rights and all the other things that we associate with human beings we see around us. Similar idea there in utero. At some point, that clearly human being that is genetically human, is alive and developing in its mother's womb. At some point in a secular understanding, it becomes a person, and that happens at birth when it starts interacting with other human beings. So it's not the intrinsic abilities of that baby, perhaps, it is something else makes it a person. Very interestingly, if you read some secular philosophers, there's one called Peter Stringer in Australia, talks about personhood being something that can come after birth. He says, when does a human being evolve beyond the level of a chimpanzee? Well, he said it's around about age 2. If you've got babies, they're not speaking, they're not able to move, they are at a functional level below a chimpanzee, an adult chimpanzee. So he says it's only when they overtake in functional terms an adult chimpanzee that they become a person. And so he raises the possibility of post-birth abortion. Why should that be wrong? If we'd be more, well, I don't suppose any of us would be happy about killing a chimpanzee, but we do accept the death of animals. Should we accept the death of newly born humans? Or what about humans with severe disability, and so on? So there's this idea, this secular idea of personhood, which is the second piece you need to get a human being. You need human genetics and life, but you also need this idea of personhood. This photo shows Anne Faraday. She was the former head of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, BPAS, which is the largest abortion provider in the UK. And she wrote this book a few years ago called The Moral Case for Abortion, where she states why this is acceptable, why it shouldn't just be something perhaps that is a dirty secret that is tolerated, but actually this is something that society should be proud of. People should be proud of working in abortion services, why there should be no, she's seeking to remove any sense of moral stigma and shame from abortion. Chapter 5 of her book is called Is It Human? Do We Care? Very striking title, and probing that idea of what is humanity. Is it enough just to have DNA and cells that are human? Does something else need to come in order for a baby to be considered a baby? She rightly identifies, a very interesting book, she rightly identifies that the moral status of the embryo is absolutely crucial in abortion. If the developing fetus is a human, same as any of us, then abortion is wrong. So crucial to her argument is arguing that the developing baby before it's born is not a human being. And this is how she does it. I put an extended quote there. Our ability to be aware of ourselves and our self-interest, to make decisions, to take responsibility for ourselves and others, to write the story of our lives, these are the things that define us as human in a way that is as important as our DNA. These personal attributes are what the fetus does not and cannot have. The presence of these qualities makes one life worthy of a secular sanctity, and their absence subjects one life to the determinations of others. So she is saying that it is those personal attributes, that idea of personhood, which a baby, and for her, a baby assumes that when they are born, and that defines human life, if you like, and human rights. And it's interesting that Anne Faraday is a very moral person, as many secular humanists are. They have very strong views of human rights and protecting the vulnerable and the weak, but they have to kind of define within that, in order to in a morally consistent way say abortion is okay, they have to say therefore that these developing babies. She doesn't deny that this baby is genetically human or that it's alive or that it's a separate organism. It clearly is. There has to be some additional qualification then that you get in order to qualify as a full member of the human race. And some of these philosophers talk about human non-persons. So an organism that is definitely human, definitely alive, but is not a person, and therefore doesn't qualify for universal human rights as the rest of us do. And she puts the criteria on these abilities of self-awareness, making decisions, taking responsibility, some kind of self-awareness, writing the story of our lives. That's what you need to do to qualify as a human in this secular worldview. What it reflects really is you might have been thinking as we've been going through, is an idea of dualism. This is just from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Dualism is the theory that the mental and the physical, mind and body or mind and brain, are in some sense radically different kinds of thing. So humans are kind of two bits bolted together that are fundamentally different, whereas in the biblical mind view, if there's that £20 note where both the matter and the form are crucial to its value. Here, humans are kind of a mental entity, if you like, coupled to a physical body. And these are radically different things, and they come together to make a human being. The fellow on the left there is Plato, and these ideas go back to ancient Greece. Plato was interested in the distinction between matter and form. He thought of the human soul as indwelling this body. He talked about the soul being imprisoned within a physical body. Matter bad, soul and spirit good. At death, the spirit is released to fly away. And so that was a kind of Platonic idea, and those ideas continue through philosophy. You have a picture there on the right of René Descartes, who really described this idea of mind-body dualism. He chose a particular location in the brain called the pineal gland, which is this sort of obscure part of the midbrain, where he felt that the mind and the body were linked, that they communicated through this pineal gland, which no one knew what it did, and he thought that was where soul and body come together. But this idea that it reflects kind of Greek ideas that matter is bad, it's always changing, and the soul is an eternal spark that is briefly trapped in this material form. As I was trying to look for kind of an analogy, if we talked about the £20 note for a biblical view of the body, I thought about perhaps the smartphone. I've cleverly positioned it there to make it look like Descartes is holding a smartphone, not very successfully. But if you imagine a smartphone, I recently got a new one, which I've got here. It is I'm not exactly sure, I think it's a Motorola. My previous one was a Samsung. And really, it doesn't really matter whether you have a Motorola or a Samsung or a Nokia or some other Huawei or some other kind of manufacturer's smartphone. What really matters is what apps you're running. And if you open it up, you've got BBC News, internet, email or whatever. And what's the interesting thing about a smartphone is what you're doing on or using that phone. Particularly if you're a young person, you've got your Instagram and your TikTok and this kind of stuff. And that is the real reason why people have smartphones. We're very disinterested in what chip it's got inside or how all the electrics work. That is a very much secondary importance. What's interesting about a smartphone is the software. And so this kind of computer analogy has been applied to human beings, that our bodies are the hardware, they're the rather boring bits, and who we really are is the programs we're running. Who I really am, if you like, is my Facebook profile. My body is unimportant, and what matters is the programs that I'm running. And that is that kind of dualistic idea that comes through and infiltrates secular views of the body, that you've got this human body, which is not very much importance in itself, and it's only when it becomes a person and starts making choices, starts running software, that's when it becomes a person, a full human being. This is really dissected very, very nicely in this book, which I think came out only 2 or 3 years ago. It's by Nancy Pearcey, who is a Christian writer and I suppose you'd say philosopher, working in the US, formerly an agnostic and then became a Christian. She previously wrote a book called total truth, which you may have come across, which was drawing on work previously by Francis Schaeffer, who founded the Faraday Institute. And this is a really excellent book. She draws on sort of Schaeffer's instincts about how we have a discordant view of reality in the modern world, the fact-value dichotomy. So this is the idea that in public life, there are a set of facts that we all have to agree with. And then there's an upper story, which is about values, which are private and subjective and relative. So, for example, a public fact, people would say you cannot be, in the public understanding, you cannot be a climate change denier. Science says that climate is changing due to human activity. That may well be true. That's not the point of what I'm saying here, but you cannot disagree with that. That is a fact. That's what science has shown. Likewise, you cannot disagree with the idea that masks prevent coronavirus transmission. If you disagree with that, you are outside the fold. That these are the facts, they're established in science, and everyone has to agree. They're public, objective, and universal. However, you are free to have your values, which are true for you and have no bearing on what someone else may say. So if you try to say to someone else, Jesus Christ is the only saviour, he's at the right hand of God, he's coming back, and it's only through faith in his name that people can come into relationship with God and have sins forgiven and enjoy eternal life. If you claim that kind of exclusivity or objectivity about something which is on that top tier of value, well, that is viewed as deeply insensitive and wrong, because there's the idea that these things that we believe about God, about the universe, about existential things are inherently private and subjective, that there's no rational conversation there, that these are simply things that you believe subjectively, and we can't have valid discussions between ourselves. So Nancy Pearcey takes that idea of a fact value dichotomy and applies it to human existence, which she does like this. The body is an expendable biological organism, and in some ways our bodies are very unimportant, and they're simply machines, simply DNA replicating machines, if you like. And what's really important is our person has moral value and legal standing, and that's in terms of our decision making, our projection of ourselves, all those things that Anne Faraday was talking about as being necessary to be a human person. And she draws this out in a load of really very interesting ways. So she says, for example, this is a way of understanding current debate about transgenderism, that I have this body which looks to you to be male and has X and Y chromosomes, but that doesn't affect who I am, because I am the person. I'm the top story, and I'm the way I project myself. And so if I understand myself to be female, despite the fact that I have a male body, what really matters, who I really am, is that top tier person. And so therefore the body can be changed, could be manipulated. Society should celebrate that being transformed to match what I consider myself to be. Radically different to a Christian view, which sees the person, the body and the soul as being radically combined. Here in this secular view, they're radically different. So again, if you have a body that no longer functions as you want it to, because you are the person, you are the software. If your smartphone ceases to work as you want it to, you put it in the bin, get a new one, because there's no getting a new body. But when we've finished with old technology, we get rid of it, because you are the person, you are the programs that this hardware is running. You are the decision making and the self-actualizing person who inhabits this physical machine that we call a body. So I think that's a quite helpful way. And she, in this book, which I do recommend to you if you're interested in these ideas, she draws us out in terms of gender and sexuality and beginning of life ethics, end of life ethics, embryos, and all these different areas of human identity and medical ethics. At that point, I'm going to stop. And I've just put up there my rival ideas of human identity, the £20 note, and the smartphone, software, hardware distinction. I'm just going to ask there whether people have any questions. That's the kind of first half, just looking at the philosophical way of understanding these questions of identity. And then after that, we shall move in and sort of apply it a bit more pastorally to real life scenarios. So I'm going to stop talking there. Did anyone have anything they wanted to say, or any questions or comments?
There was a comment from Tina in the chat, which was also my question. So if in the secular view of that life begins after birth, but if you're defining it in terms of the ability to interact with others and so on, I mean, as you said, a baby doesn't have those attributes. So how does someone like Anne Farida, why as a baby after it's born valuable?
Yeah, she struggles actually. I don't think that the book works, and that's just one of the reasons. She would talk, I mean, it's a hard book to read actually, and I read through that chapter, and it's hard to read. She would even go so far as to use the idea of the human. She would talk as another of those aspects of personhood about a degree of independence, and actually she goes so far as to say that that these babies are not persons. I think she would say that even a newborn baby may not meet all the criteria for personhood, but she would then go further and say that human fetus is occupying the mother's body without consent. That is kind of the way she would argue that, which I must say that's very difficult to read. I really struggle to kind of understand that, but she would say that she would use the word parasites to describe that baby. If it's an unwanted occupant of the mother's body, it has no right to be there, and the woman has absolute self-determination over her body and how she uses it. And it's very, very stark actually, and I've used that before in a talk to talk about the difference there between that and Christian medical ethics, where in Christian medical ethics the strong lay down their rights for the weak. Secular ethic, you know, the weak, the baby is being asked to lay down their rights for the strong, the one on whom they're dependent. And the whole idea that dependence is a problem, that dependence demeans your dignity as a human being because you have to earn your personhood through being independent. It's very, very challenging to us as Christians, and ultimately it's wrong. I think it's just morally wrong. You see that because God's shone his light into our hearts.
I think Tina has a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. For me, the two implications of Anna Faradi's view are that infants can be aborted after birth. That is a logical following. And also, people with severe disabilities no longer have personhood because they do not fulfill those criteria. And that's really scary at either end. And it also feeds into the end of life care. If you are no longer independent, you can no longer make choices for yourself. We reserve the right to treat you not as a person. And that's really, really, really serious.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's really chilling, and we have this awful situation in British law at the moment that, as I mentioned, that you know, fetal life is protected. It pretty much after 24 weeks, you can, you know, abortion is very heavily restricted, but it's still allowed in any cases of fetal handicap. And we managed to tolerate that alongside an ethic that says we should be building ramps into our public libraries and doing everything we can to help disabled people to access services and care and be treated equally and so on. So we have this total doublethink where as soon as a baby is born with disabilities, we pull out all stops to look after them. And yet we say that, that they can be aborted up to term for what are often very mild disabilities. There's a great group called Don't Screen Us Out. I don't know if anyone's come across them, which is a an organisation of people with Down syndrome and parents of children with Down syndrome. Recently, in the last few years, NICE have given a technological approval to cell-free DNA screening, which is basically a simple blood test that gives almost 100% certainty as to whether or not a developing baby has Down syndrome. So this is now being brought into the screening process for all pregnancies, being recommended for all mothers. And there's the real concern that this will basically eradicate Down syndrome, because you've got an ability to pick it up in almost all cases, and then free access to abortion. And I think I'm right in saying that in Iceland, where they're, I hate to say ahead of us in this regard, where they've implemented these technologies, I think I'm right in saying that there hasn't been a baby born with Down syndrome for 10 years. Certainly the numbers of Down syndrome children have fallen, I think, by 80 or 90% in this country, because of selective abortion. But yeah, it's got implications right across the board: end of life care, care for people with disabilities, and fundamentally our view of what it is to be human, that humanity is not something you have by being human, it's something you have to earn by fulfilling those criteria of personhood.
Well, I had a question, which I think hopefully will turn into a question as I say it. I think maybe the secular world would want to say that we're, like, as Christians, are the dualistic ones, that kind of our Christians will think about body and they have this concept of the soul, but kind of us as a secular world has got rid of this soul idea, and actually we have this united view of we are just like our physical existence. I just wonder if you have thoughts on kind of where that came from. Is it just because kind of Plato has kind of gone into the Christian church and then also into the secular world and gone backwards and forwards a bit? How is it that there are those two kind of slightly separate narratives about who really is dualistic?
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? Yes, I mean, the secular world is very, you know, I mean, I'm talking obviously secular world. There's everyone's different in terms of their beliefs, but if we're criticizing that secular mindset, I think it fundamentally doesn't work. It doesn't answer our views as to why certain things are important. So we as Christians recognize that we live in a world which God created, where there is moral right and wrong, where there's a spiritual reality. So we very naturally talk in those terms. And actually, as I tried to articulate, you know, man is formed out of a clay, but is breathed into by God. That we have these two aspects to our humanity. The secular world will seek to strip away anything supernatural, anything spiritual, but actually you can't live like that, because the secular world at the same time would make absolute moral claims. And particularly the one I think that is particularly prevalent at the moment is the idea about universal human rights, which actually we would share, that, you know, people are valuable wherever they live and whatever level of income or disability or racial background or whatever, that human rights are universal. And yet, where do you get that from? That is a claim to a moral existence, which is unjustified if you believe only in DNA. If you believe only in DNA, there's nothing very different about us and a chimp. And we have slightly better developed brains, we can use tools and use our hands in different ways, but actually there's nothing very different, and certainly nothing substantially different. And yet we can't live in that way. No one can live in a world where humans and animals are morally equal. People try and it doesn't work. And so they have to invent a way of giving humans special special privilege. And actually, I think what that is reflecting is the way that, the Bible talks about God's law being written on our hearts, eternity being set in the hearts of man, that actually because of how we've been made, we do recognize that humans are special. We see the image of God, even if we don't recognize it as that. We see the image of God in other human beings. There's an innate moral understanding that human beings matter, that justice matters, and so on, which we can't eradicate, but we can't explain it using science. Science explains how bodies work, but it doesn't tell us anything about the moral value of those organisms. And so there's this desperate need to create a moral structure, because humans can't work without moral structure. And so they sort of hit on this idea of personhood as some kind of intellectual explanation for it. So in terms of the idea of dualism, I think it reflects the secular world trying to reject God, but not being able to, because we live in a universe that is fundamentally moral and fundamentally reflects God's creation of it. I wonder now, if there's no other pressing questions, we can keep any others for later, whether we go on and talk, move from these big kind of philosophical ideas to right the other end, if you like, of medical ethics. So this is not especially perhaps controversial, but it's very, very pastorally prescient for all of us who have friends or relatives who engage with healthcare. So I'd like to move on, and we're going to split into groups in a moment. We're going to come to kind of practical implications. How does this play out pastorally in end-of-life decision-making? So I'm going to put up a scenario and a couple of questions, and then we'll split into groups for maybe 10 to 15 minutes and then come back after that and discuss where we've got up to. And I will put this scenario into the chat so that so you can see it later. June is a woman in her late 70s. Oh, so I'm going to have to move my my box so I can see it. Is a lady in her late 70s who is a member of your church. She has a number of long-term heart and breathing problems and has been admitted to hospital with breathlessness and a chest infection. When you visit her, she is very distressed because the doctors told her they had filled in a do not resuscitate form for her. She told them this is against her Christian beliefs, and they agreed to rediscuss later with her. These sort of resuscitation treatment dilemmas are absolutely the bread and butter of medical ethics on the wards, and I have to say I find them very, very difficult sometimes to get my head around as a clinician, helping families and patients through these things. So a couple of questions. How might a secular and Christian view of death differ? And what might the implications be for do not actively resuscitate decisions? And I'm going to put the scenario, I'm going to share that now with you. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thanks so much for sharing those things. It would be lovely to talk more. I'm going to share a few slides, but hopefully it's I think it picks up a lot of the things that that you've said. Now, here we are. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. I hope you can all see that. Is that displaying for you? So we're going to be talk now a bit about dying, and just to acknowledge that thanks so much, Bob, for sharing your recent experiences. It is, a difficult subject, and so I tread very sensitively, and I hope that this will be upbuilding for us, and any offence or anything, I hope that you'll take it in a good spirit. Understanding illness, this is a really kind of difficult graph to put up, but this is broadly how people die in this country. People talk about 3 ways of dying, 3 sort of trajectories. I'm sorry it's a graph, but this is a science conference, so you can't complain about that. On the y-axis, the up and down is level of function. So that's your ability to get yourself up in the morning, wash yourself, clean your teeth, go to the shops, cook yourself food. And then the x-axis along the bottom is time. And so they say people with kind of malignant diseases, the sort of yellowy line, sort of have a steep decline, and then you can choose sometimes to treat, and sometimes that's curative and disease goes away, but sometimes it puts the disease, sets the disease back, and then you return to a higher level of function and then do it again and jump. And there's decisions to be made at each of those points as to whether you're going to have more treatment, whether this is wise to have another round of chemotherapy or whatever it might be, another operation. Then they talk about other patients dying according to the blue line, a kind of organ failure type thing. Perhaps someone's got chronic lung disease or chronic heart disease. and ends up with a series of exacerbations that then get better, and they go home again, but a bit worse than perhaps they were before, and then another exacerbation. And again, at each of those troughs, you might have decisions about how far we're going to go with medical treatment. Is the patient going to come into hospital? If they come into hospital, are they going to go to intensive care? Are they going to be put on a ventilator? And these are really difficult decisions. You're trying to predict what's the likely outcome. Where is the patient in the course of their illness? Because of course, all of us are going to die, and for someone with heart failure or something, it will be during one of those exacerbations. When is it right to treat and when is it not? And then much more commonly nowadays, this kind of frailty trajectory shown by the orange line at the bottom. We lost my grandfather a couple of years ago. He was 90, gosh, what was he, 96, I think, when he died, 97. Had progressive dementia for 10 or 15 years and was, almost entirely dependent, not really recognizing us by the time he died. Very, very long course and difficult decisions about what is right to do in each of those scenarios. Decisions need to be made about embarking on burdensome treatments, weighing up risks and benefits. We talk in medicine about ceilings of care, which is a sort of technical term. If you admitted a patient to hospital, if they were to deteriorate, would you send them to intensive care? Do you think that they would be suitable to go onto a mechanical ventilator? I mean, those decisions were really thrown into sharp relief with the COVID pandemic, and trying to find ways of determining who is suitable for escalation. Then we talked about do not attempt CPR decisions, which was relevant in this case, based on the fact that outcomes from cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that means the kind of chest compressions, the outcomes of that in patients who are hospitalized are really poor. Probably only about 10% of patients who have a cardiac arrest in hospital end up leaving hospital. But then there is that 10%. So who is that? In which situations is that appropriate? And then further down the line, when is it right to actually stop active treatment and focus on a patient's symptomatic care? Quality rather than quantity of life. And what my reflection on this is that it's added a lot more fear to what was already a difficult situation. Dying and terminal illness has always been, is intrinsically difficult, and will challenge all of us when we reach that stage. The illness itself, pain, symptoms, disability, the dying process, what comes next, those have been there since the creation of the world, since the fall. This is the human experience of facing death. But science and modern medical care has added two additional sources of fear. The first is overtreatment, and some people will think about the idea of being kind of dragged in and out of hospital, having drips and needles and procedures and stomas and chemotherapy and all that as an absolute horror. I work as a dialysis doctor, and some people, the idea of being on dialysis and coming up and down to hospital 3 times a week is about the worst thing they could possibly imagine. And there's this idea that you get trapped on this medical experimental conveyor belt and you can't get off. Other people, and many Christians actually fall into this bracket, are very worried about undertreatment, the feeling that there's this kind of elite medical establishment that writes off people, that is kind of tacitly euthanizing people by not giving them treatment, bumping off old people when they're viewed as being past their best. And so those two fears, really, overtreatment, undertreatment, which different people will feel in different ways, are a reality of the success, if you like, of medical science. How do we navigate these decisions as Christians? I think it's fascinating to talk about a Christian view of death. Is death always a bad thing? Very few scriptures to shed light on this. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die, says God to Adam and Eve in the garden. And so death, yes, is part of the curse. It's part of the fall. It's part of a fallen world. It's a curse. It's a punishment for human sin. There's no idea that death is good. In some secular ways of thinking would downplay death. It's just the ending of a biological organism. It's just the end of the circle of life, and you know, you just go into the ground and come up as a new plant or something. Actually, the Bible will be very clear that death is really bad. And if you've ever seen a dead body, it's a very awful thing in many ways. That humans, I remember when I was a house officer and I just qualified and I had to certify my first death, and you go into the room and the body there is human, but it doesn't turn around and look at you. You know, there's no recognition. It feels cold, and there's something profoundly wrong about death. It's talked about as the enemy in 1 Corinthians. When Jesus is at the tomb of Lazarus, he has that reaction. You know, it says Jesus was deeply moved. He weeps at the tomb of Lazarus. There's something so wrong about death. This wrenching apart of spirit and body. It's deeply wrong. Is it always a bad thing? Well, other scriptures in different ways. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? It's a defeated enemy. It's a terrible enemy, but it's one that's had the barb removed. It no longer has the ability to hurt us, or those who are in Christ. Obviously, it doesn't apply to those who are outside him, but those who are in Christ, death is a defeated enemy. That picture there is of Simeon in the temple, and he famously says this phrase in Latin, Nunc dimittis, now dismiss your servant in peace. This faithful saint who for decades had been looking for the consolation of Israel. And finally, he holds in his arms the baby Jesus, and he says, right, I'm ready to go. Death is no longer this thing that must be fought at all costs. There's a time when Christians can be released. Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. That the sting has been drawn from death. We no longer fear it and avoid it at all costs. Even in the Old Testament, when calamity comes, the wicked are brought down, but even in death, the righteous seek refuge in God. I was called on to do a panel discussion for the medical school at Barts and London Medical School a couple of years ago. It sounds like the beginning of a joke. There was me, there was a rabbi, an imam, some sort of Buddhist lady. I can't remember if there's one or two others, and representatives of all the major faiths. And we were, you know, the medical students were asking us for the view of our faiths on death, and it was very interesting that the Muslim chaplain there was quite kind of resigned and said it's in the will of Allah, and you know, when it comes, it comes. You don't fight it so much. The Jewish rabbi who was there was many Jewish people have a very active view towards care at the end of life. They are very resistant to having care withdrawn. It's something to be fought and fought and fought right to the very end. And I expressed this biblical idea that actually it is an enemy. It is profoundly wrong. It's never something we would seek or hasten, but it's not an enemy to be feared for those who are in Christ, because it's the gateway into the presence of Christ, and that rest which comes. Revelation 13 talks about those saints who are resting from their labours. So it's a nuanced thing in Scripture. This is Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the famous minister of, I think it was Westminster Hall in the 20th century, and he was in his declining years, he was ill, and he said this to his friends: don't pray for healing. Don't try to hold me back from the glory. If you ever go into hospital and you're asked about your wishes from CPR, maybe you could put that on the form. Don't try to hold me back from the glory. So very interesting in that discussion, and it comes really that idea of this lady in your church who's been admitted, and there's questions about CPR decisions and perhaps intensive care and ventilators and things like that. I was in exactly this situation a few months ago with COVID, and a lovely Christian lady from our church was admitted to my hospital with COVID pneumonia, and really struggled to know what to do. And there were lots of these issues about resuscitation and about intensive care. She had some coexisting medical problems. No one from the church could visit her because the hospital was closed. except me. So I was able to go and visit her quite regularly, which was such a blessing. God is so kind. And we had these discussions, and initially she moved from wanting everything, from being really frightened of dying and the process involved, and she was in for weeks and weeks, and actually in that time came round, and by the end of it she was ready, and she was actually looking forward to seeing the Lord and wasn't wanting lots of additional stuff, and that was a journey, and it was a process, and it was difficult. And it's just to say that we sometimes think of medical ethics in this kind of philosophical, confrontational, debating way, when it was actually a lot of it is, it's got very pastoral, a very pastoral component. Equally at the beginning of life, thinking about infertility or unexpected pregnancies and so on, and there's a real pastoral component, the need for compassion and grace to be mixed with truth and mixed with the illumination we get from God's word, so that this meets people's needs. I'm going to pause again there, and then I've got one final section. But did anyone want to come back with anything from that little section? If not, I shall push on, and then we can have some more conversation later. So I'm just going to fold all you away so I can see my slides again. So the final bit, the direction of travel, and particularly here I want to look at one area which I've been probably more heavily involved with than any other medical ethical issue, and that's to do with assisted suicide and euthanasia, the direction of travel perhaps. This assisted suicide and the euthanasia debate keeps rearing its head. It's not going to go away. There's been repeated attempts to legalise this in the UK, and they are destined to continue. I just think it's worth thinking, what are the drivers? Why are people so keen to see assisted suicide legalised? And to go back to our earlier analogy of the mobile phone and the hardware and software, I think this is, if you go back 30, 40 years, the argument for euthanasia was all being driven from compassion. There was this belief that people suffer intolerably at the end of their life, that people have unremitting pain from malignant conditions or whatever, and that the only right thing to do is to, in quotes, put them out of their misery or whatever, these arguments. You wouldn't let a dog suffer like that. Well, actually, that kind of unrelieved suffering is not really seen anymore. Medicine is good at treating these symptoms. And those arguments, sometimes they're voiced, but I don't think that's the main driver for why assisted suicide is being pushed with such force. Actually, now if you look behind the arguments that are being made, it's all about autonomy, it's all about choice and me being able to drive myself. If you go back to the analogy of the mobile phone, when your mobile phone is, when it's no longer working, when it's slowed down and the screen's cracked and it's falling apart, and it's you're no longer able to access your social media account, and it's no longer fit for purpose. Well, you put it in the bin and you get a new one. And it's this idea that I am the programs that I'm playing. So when my mind starts to go, and dementia is the big driver for this, when I'm no longer able to do all the things I want, when I can no longer go traveling and meet people and go to dinner and this kind of stuff, when I'm not enjoying that quality of life, when the software is not able to run, that's the time to switch off the hardware. No idea that we are unified beings. Actually, when my body's failing me, we pull the plug on it. This is a secular philosopher, Pollack. I have no sense of guilt on pulling the plug on any machine. I am a machine. My body is a machine. I inhabit it. When the machine's no longer working, we turn it off. Or Singer, who we talked about earlier, the post-birth abortion guy, he talks about people with dementia as once persons. Once they're no longer able to think and articulate themselves, they're no longer persons. He says that they are alive biologically, but not biographically. If you're no longer writing your life story and doing the things that you wish to do and determining yourself, then you're no longer a person. Briefly, just to clarify some technical things, assisted dying is doctors supplying lethal drugs to people who meet certain criteria so that they can use them to end their life. And associated with that is euthanasia, where the doctor is actually administering the drug. And different attempts to legalise this have used different formulations of those two things. Very different from withdrawing care. And actually, as I said, I'm a dialysis doctor, and we often dialyse people who are coming towards the end of their life and becoming more frail. And there's an appropriate point, I think all medical ethicists would say this, Christian and secular, there's an appropriate point, either if the patient doesn't want any more treatment, or if it's proving excessively burdensome, or it's not doing anything, not helping the patient, that you withdraw. There's also a kind of concept of double effect prescribing, where you can give painkiller drugs to kill pain, accepting they may shorten life. I mean, actually, I don't think that's, just on a technical note, I don't think that really is a phenomenon. But there is some idea that you can give things with symptomatic intent, even if they might shorten life. It's ethically appropriate. It's rarely clinically the case. Actually, if you deal with people's pain, they tend to live longer. But anyway, very clear here, we're talking about administering drugs to shorten life. Very, very different from CPR decisions or withdrawing care. So that is a picture of the Dignitas clinic, in case you've ever been interested to know what it looks like. It's in a car park outside Zurich. Currently, assisted suicide and euthanasia are illegal in the UK. They're opposed by most medical organisations. There are no medical organisations except specific, doctors for assisted dying type groups. There are no medical organisations that are in favour of this. One or two are neutral, and the majority are opposed at present. There have been multiple parliamentary attempts to legalise it, which have failed, most recently in 2015. And then there have been attempts through the courts to get judges to say that actually in this particular case it's okay, which would then lead to a kind of de facto changing of the law. The real battleground at the moment is over the medical institutions, because the people who want to see this legalised it's a big problem to them that the professional bodies are against it. And so there's been a real fight in the Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of GPs, and the BMA currently about what the position they will take on assisted suicide is. At the moment, all three of them are broadly against. The RCP is officially neutral, but is de facto, again, is clearly non-supportive of a change in the law. The RCGP, Royal College of General Practitioners, is strongly against. The BMA is officially against, but is reviewing its position in the autumn. And there's real concern that they may move to a position of acceptance on it. So the chief arguments against, and I've been involved in articulating these, three main ones. Firstly, that it's unnecessary, that it's possible to care for patients properly, and investment should be in good palliative care to achieve good symptom control, and also allowing patients to make choices and be cared for in the location they want. And that when you do these things, when you care for people properly, that they don't express this desire to take their lives. So the kind of unnecessary argument. The unsafe arguments that if you legalise this for people who are really pushing hard for it, actually there's an awful lot of vulnerable people who will then be pressurised into it. Very difficult to detect coercion, very difficult to detect people who are depressed, who might express a wish to die, that if you treat them and if you talk to them, that goes away. So the idea that it's unsafe, experience from overseas, showing that's the case. If you look at the Oregon data, which I find really heartbreaking, well over 50% of people in Oregon who go for assisted dying say that they do so because they feel a burden on family and friends, and that is a key part of their decision making, and that I find that very heartbreaking, that is a reason for people ending their lives. And then finally, the kind of unethical idea, this is never part of medicine, that doctors don't take lives. We care for people, we treat them, we comfort them, but we certainly don't take life. And the intrinsic value of human life. You've got the Hippocrates on the left, the father of medicine, and the Hippocratic oath that forbids doctors from shortening life. not actually taken by any of us anymore, but that principle that's been there for centuries, that doctors don't take life, I think is so important. We have to defend that. At the bottom is Cicely Saunders, who was a believer, a doctor who was responsible for the hospice movement, at which the UK leads the world, developing modern palliative care. Should Christians get involved? Well, there's a verse from Proverbs: speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And I think as Christians, we can rightly be concerned about trying to make non-Christians live by Christian standards, or trying to turn Britain into a Christian country, whatever that means, and some of the issues around their Christian government. But I think here there's a very strong moral mandate. I'm absolutely convinced that if the law changes here, that many vulnerable, elderly, disabled people will be pressurized into thinking that their lives are of no value and that society would prefer them to be dead and not consuming resources. And so I think this really is a case where Christians should be speaking up for what is right, and defending the rights of the poor and needy. That's the end of the presentation. I'm just going to put up this slide, which has a few resources, some of the ones that I've mentioned already. I wanted to highlight those website pages on the left, the CMF files. If you just Google CMF files, then you'll bring them up. There's about 70 of them, and they're on all sorts of different ethical issues. And if you're ever dealing with a particular, 3-person embryos or some obscure aspect of medical ethics, you'll find something from a biblical perspective there. I'd highlight that one, 68, which came out a couple of years ago, as a very good place to start. Reflects many of the topics that we've been discussing today. Then there's the Nancy Pearcey book that I mentioned earlier, which is excellent in understanding culture and our view of the body and sexuality and all those other things. And then I've highlighted 3 books by John Wyatt, who's a member of the CMF, professor of pediatrics, though he's not mainly does ethical stuff now. Matters of Life and Death is an absolutely classic text about medical ethics from a Christian perspective, and it's a really good read. He writes extremely well. Dying Well deals with some of these pastoral issues about dying and the spiritual journey people go on as they face death, and a bit about different dilemmas in terms of treatment decisions. And then Right to Die is his look at the specifically at the assisted dying, euthanasia debate. So those are all excellent resources. But I shall stop talking now. I think we're more or less at the end of the allocated time. But I'm very happy if there were additional questions, and if I'm given permission, then I'm very happy to talk more if there was anything anyone wanted to ask.
Thank you, David. You've given us a lot to